Hello there, let's cast our minds back to before the 1980s and explore the different ways you might design a versatile polyphonic keyboard. I'm talking about a single instrument that can make a large variety of different sounds, so we don't want to look at anything as rigid or as old-fashioned as harpsichords, pianos or organs. We want to look to the future of the 1940s to the 1970s. Most synthesizers contain quite a bit of electronics to make a repeating shape using an oscillator and then remove parts of the sounds with a filter and then make the sounds louder and then quieter over time with an amplifier or attenuator. This is all well and good if you'd only like to play one note at a time. Monophonic synthesizers are just about affordable and you can only sing one note at a time anyway. What about polyphonic synthesizers if you want to play a whole chord at once? A true polyphonic synthesizer will simply brute force the approach. If it can play 4 notes, it basically has 4 separate synthesizers inside it. Sure, it only has one keyboard and one set of dials, but that information is carefully divided up and passed along to 4 lots of electronic circuits, each one an identical monophonic synthesizer. While this is a simple solution, it's also as expensive as it sounds. So what other options are there for electronic polyphony? With a multitrack recorder, you can record each monophonic part separately, then play them all back together. But that takes time. Say you have a song that's 3 minutes and 20 seconds long and it needs a polyphonic part playing 3-note chords, you'd have to split the polyphonic part up to 3 monophonic parts and record these one at a time, which would take 10 minutes. And that's before you factor in how long it would take to work out which note to play when. You probably also want to record a few seconds of each part first just to make sure that they do sound right together and alter the patch accordingly before you start recording the full thing. That's a lot of time, and that's for mechanical sounding quantized music. If you want to play expressively, speeding up and slowing down slightly as your heart desires, then you don't want to have to try to match all those exact changes 2 more times. It's just not feasible. Personally, I fake polyphony using multitracking quite often, but I can get away with it because I'm using modern technology. Thanks to MIDI and basic polyphonic scratch instruments to compose on, I can program in polyphonic parts with expressive tempo changes, velocities and mod wheel tweaking, and then separate out the notes to monophonic parts very quickly. This wasn't an option until the 80s. Harry Chamberlin reasoned that if he could record his organ to tape, why not just record a few seconds of each individual note to a different tape and then wire up the keys to tape players. That way, he could play recordings of any instrument, albeit not very expressively. He could then use his keyboard playing skills to sort of perform on strings, flutes and even choirs. This was a ridiculously simplistic idea that, shockingly, actually worked, at least most of the time. The Chamberlin isn't known for being particularly stable. This was the start of sampling and it was entirely analog. The Musicians' Union was not impressed. Chamberlin hired his window cleaner, Bill Franson, to sell his instrument. Franson went missing and upon closer inspection has snuck off to England. Claiming to be the instrument's inventor, he sold the rights he didn't have to an English company. This company made their own version, which became much more well known, the Mellotron. Depending on your age, you may have heard the Mellotron in the Beatles' Strawberry Fields Forever or 9 Inch Nails' Downward Spiral. Not only do these songs use the same flute samples, performed on the same model of Mellotron, but they're actually performed on the exact same Mellotron, by way of co-founder of Interscope Records, Jimmy Iovine. Don't even get me started on Jimmy. Brief forays into rock aside, the Mellotron was mostly used in prog rock and cosmic music. Although I don't listen to that much of either, I do listen to a lot of Pete Namlock's ambient music, which is very much influenced by cosmic music and uses what sounds like a Mellotron extensively. There was another similar instrument called the Orchestron. Instead of playing a few dozen tapes, it played a few dozen rings on a single optical disc. Before you think of CDs, remember this was the 70s and all analog. If anything, the Orchestron was even lower fidelity than the Mellotron, but it did have an advantage. Each note looped, albeit imperfectly due to the length being dictated by the size of the ring on the disc. The Orchestron doesn't appear to have been anywhere near as popular as the Mellotron. However, what it lacks in quantity of users, it certainly makes up for with quality, given that it was used extensively by Kraftwerk, who were then sampled by Afrika Bambaataa and New Order. And not in the more obscure work either. The string sound was featured in Trans-Europe Express, sampled into Planet Rock, while the choir sound was featured in Radioactivity, sampled into Blue Monday. Yes fan Dave Biro couldn't afford a Mellotron, but he could afford a bunch of old 8-track tape players. 8-track tapes could be looped, so he designed his own instruments that could loop sounds indefinitely, like the Orchestron. He showed his instrument to Yes's Rick Wakeman, who was very receptive to the idea of a smaller, more reliable Tron. Money was spent, people were hired, including the improbably named Roger Rogers, and the design was further refined, including a separate envelope generator for each note so they could independently fade in and out. This machine, dubbed the Birotron, would become the definitive Tron, albeit slightly diminished by never actually being commercially released. Still, it was a nice idea, and that about wraps it up for the Trons. These days, digital samplers have rendered analog samplers obsolete. Even if you like the sound of the Trons, you can simply buy a digital sample library of them. You get the portability, the reliability, and you can even use those note-fading independent envelope generators on the Mellotron and orchestral sounds too. But again, this wasn't an option until the late 80s at the earliest. Okay, back to the 70s. There was a market for keyboards that could make something resembling string and choir sounds without the weight and temperament of a few dozen tape players in a big box. That's a lot to load into your van whenever you want to gig. But synthesizers, as fun as they sound, are too expensive to make fully polyphonic. Enter string machines, which use some cunning trickery to fake polyphony. First, you don't need a separate oscillator per note, you can have just one, and then use divider circuitry to derive all the other notes from it, all the time, regardless of whether they're actually heard. This means you can't have independent portamento, gliding notes, you can only glide every single note together as a cohesive whole. As hardly anyone does that anyway, that's a good start. As for the filtering, we can just send all the oscillators through one set of filters if we put them after the amplifier that determines which notes we can and can't hear. That's a money saver. The envelope generator is nice to fade notes in and out, but to really cut costs, let's just have one, so you can only fade in all the notes at once at the beginning and then fade all of them out again at the end. Any fancy playing in between is just maximum volume. Good enough! Finally, let's run everything through some BBDs to thicken up the sound in glorious stereo. Now we've got something that, although it won't fool anyone into thinking they're listening to a violin, does sound pretty decent when buried in a full mix. These corner cutting measures mean string machines aren't technically polyphonic, they're paraphonic, with all the notes sharing the same circuitry, only rising and lowering as one cohesive whole. But at the reduced cost, who cares? It's good enough. That's how string machines work, but they're not very versatile. They just sound like a synthesizer pretending to be a string section. However, Roland's VP-330 goes 2 steps further. The first step is to include more filters that can shape the sounds the same way the human mouth does, turning these strings into voices-ish. It doesn't sound realistic, but it does sound stylistic and vaguely reminiscent of a choir, and it's certainly cheaper than paying several singers. The second step is that it's also a vocoder. A vocoder measures how loud various different frequencies are in one sound and then replicates that combination with a different sound. Although it was originally designed to compress speech for telephones, it's usually used to make it sound as if a synthesizer, or occasionally a guitar, is singing. By building a vocoder into a string machine, Roland made a vocoder that can sing several notes at once. Perhaps the most famous music to use the VP-330 is Vangelis' film soundtracks, specifically Chariots of Fire and Blade Runner. These days, any laptop or tablet can easily fire up an emulation of any of these instruments, or for that matter, a realistic emulation of a whole orchestra. But it's nice to consider the history of people trying to make limited technology do more than it was supposed to. Whew! It sure can be hard lugging this orchestra around with me while I make videos, which is why I use Sally Tortle's patented, not a Chamberlin, genuine synthetic orchestra. Use the code OK maybe a little bit Chamberlin to claim your exclusive discount. This advert is a joke, so sales are non-refundable.
I'm playing chords and singing at the same times until the credits finish rolling. That's probably about enough.